Hi there, welcome everybody. We'd like to get a bit of a jump start on our second session. So if my speakers can turn your cameras on, that would be great. Okay, I'd like to welcome everyone to our second session, Theorizing Music Theory. My colleague and mentor Ian Quinn once told me that he thinks of music theorists as the caretakers of music's meta-languages. When we do music theory, we're undertaking the ontological, historical, perceptual, and semiotic responsibility of segmenting, naming, and relating music's elementary units to one another. Music theories shape and are shaped by the musicianship of expert performers, the lesson planning of college professors and piano teachers, the earliest musical experiences of young people, and the diverse listening expectations of all the world's ears. In organizing this conference, Nina Eichheim and Daniel Walden are drawing our attention to the world making we're all engaging in when we talk about music and sound. When we recognize that music theories are inescapably made of metaphors, we have to acknowledge that music theories inevitably reflect the racism, ableism, sexism, and other power structures that shape our lives, and we're faced with the sorely needed but exciting creative task of re-languaging music to show more care for one another. We have a fabulous group of scholars with us today to start this conversation, and please look to the chat for full speaker bios as well as live captioning for today's event. Philip Ewell will deliver our keynote titled Musical Metaphor as a Racialized Structure. TEKLA Babyak will then give a paper titled Amputated Limbs and Breathless Lungs, Ableist Metaphors in A.B. Marx's Theories of Modality. And finally, Steve B. Lee will give a paper titled Better Sense, Manouche Musicians, Aural Listening, and the Transformation of Racialized Metaphors. Each scholar will speak for 10 minutes, and then we'll have a 15-minute Q&A. So, Phil, would you like to take it away?
I will. Thank you so much, Jade, and thanks everyone for having me. And it's really great to be to be part of this very estimable panel and conference. I'm going to share my screen and get going. Sharing screen will stop other computers' sound share. Do you want to continue? I'm going to continue now. And yes, here it is. And I'm going to jump right in and mention that briefly that I have a bibliography. You can find it on my website. Follow me on Twitter if you're interested. Thanks so much again. Musical metaphor as a racialized structure. Western civilization as metaphor and origin myth. Many scholars have shown that the idea that ancient Greece was the sole progenitor of Western civilization was at best spurious and at worst harmful. Historians such as Nell Irving Painter, Kwame Anthony Appiah, and classicists Rebecca Futo Kennedy, who notes that the concept of Western civ itself doesn't emerge until the late 19th century. And when it does, it is explicitly white supremacist. Obviously, classical music's Western musical canon is the product of the concept of Western civilization and can also be easily tied to America's historic white supremacy. Perhaps the most significant historian to take on the origin myths of Western civilization was Martin Bernal in his 3-volume Black Athena, in which he forms two models for Greek history, namely what he calls the European or Aryan model on the one hand, and the Levantine or ancient model on the other. Ultimately, he suggests that we should replace the European model with the ancient one which accepts the fact that Egypt colonized Greece long before Socrates came along, a history that the ancient Greeks themselves acknowledged. This, he urges, because the newer European or Aryan model was based on racist thought and white supremacy. Of course, the concept of racial purity, outlined in part here on the slide, was an obsession of white supremacists, and the Aryan model of ancient Greece successfully promoted racial purity. Bernal shows that the creation of the European Aryan model of ancient Greece served as a perfect mythology and a perfect metaphor to sustain and justify not just Western greatness, but its violent excursions across the globe and rapacious lust for colonies outside of Europe. If Europe and its racial whiteness were to be put forth as superior, it would need a grand metaphor to sell this superiority. And the European Aryan model of ancient Greece provided just that. Unsurprisingly, Martin Bernal's landmark Black Athena caused immediate controversy. Perhaps the most ardent defender of the divine provenance of the ancient Greeks was classicist Mary Lefkowitz, who wrote a monograph, not out of Africa, How Afrocentrism Became an Excuse to Teach Myth as History. I find it telling that Lefkowitz adds teaching myth as history in the subtitle of her monograph, since teaching the ancient Greeks is so often exactly that. Think here of the almost certainly false story of Pythagoras at the blacksmith's shop, in which he divined through hammers of proportionate weight the octave, fifth, and fourth. We in music theory have created an entire metaphor of Pythagoras and those hammers at the shop. And somehow it seems perfectly fine to treat this metaphor as somehow authoritative, if not factual, and not mythological, which it almost certainly was. This brings up the largest problem with Lefkowitz's counter-arguments, which are consistently heard when someone wisely questions the issue of race and gender in historical accounts of white male exceptionalism, and exceptionalism never described as such, of course. In a 2018 piece, Black Athena, White Power, classicist Denise Eileen McCoskey calls out Lefkowitz's belief that Afrocentrism pursued readings of the ancient world based in emotion, bias, and the need to build self-esteem, while classics, tightly wrapped in the mantle of objectivity, rigorously sought the truth. This spot-on criticism of Lefkowitz resonates deeply with me, since many in conservative quarters of music theory, the vast majority of whom are in fact white men, have criticized my own Afrocentric work, combining race scholarship with music theory as emotional and biased, while their own arguments are to be considered reasoned and objective. But this is one of the most effective tactics in the promotion of our white male frame, namely, painting the person questioning our racialized and gendered structures as an emotional and unhinged critic, while those who defend the status quo are heroes of the natural order of things and of the truth. McCoskey continues, such a dichotomy that emotional people of color politicize history while reasonable white people seek objective fact was patently false in the 1980s, even as it became a staple in the arsenal of arguments defending the exclusionary practices of many disciplines. Patently false indeed. Regrettably, there are still those in the academic study of music who hide behind ancient and not so ancient metaphors to deny that our American musical institutions and structures contain any racialized or gendered aspect to them at all, which sadly impoverishes academic music for all of us. The Western canon as metaphor. To see how the Western metaphor played out in music, I'll turn briefly to the 4th and 10th editions of A History of Western Music by Donald Grout. The 4th, which added Claude Poliska, was very much like the previous 3 editions. They say, quote, the history of Western music, art music properly begins with the music of the Christian church. But all through the Middle Ages and even to the present time, artists and intellectuals have continually turned back to Greece and Rome for instruction, for correction, and for inspiration in their several fields of work. This has been true in music. With these words, the origin myths of ancient Greece in music were solidified. Grout and Poliska explicitly tie Western art music to the Christian church, a church that obviously didn't exist in ancient Greece. Here, the authors are splitting the difference. Western music began with the Christian church, but it also didn't because it began with ancient Greece. Of course, there were many musical traditions that predated those of the Christian church or ancient Greece for that matter, but they have been erased from this version of Western history. But Grout and Poliska were not at all exceptional in this erasure. It was, in fact, the story of mid-20th century America in all such historical accounts of music. In the 2019 10th edition, which added Peter Burkholder, many changes are notable. There are more compositions from women and BIPOC generally, and different genres such as jazz and popular. Still, the outlines from Grout's original text are ever present in this newest edition, and the pitfalls still the same. I'm made uncomfortable by many parts of the long quotation on the slide. The notion of pitting the West against Asia as some kind of antipode to the total erasure of Africa and the pre-colonial Americas. The problematic belief that our philosophy is founded on Plato and Aristotle, or that the West does not include Islam, which has been part of Europe since that religion's founding in the 7th century Common Era. But most troubling to me is the incessant use of the first person plural pronouns, our and we. I myself was born in Long Beach, California, to an African-American dad and a Norwegian mom, and I've lived for 4 years in Canada, 7 in Russia, and the rest of my life in the United States. I could therefore reasonably be called a Westerner. I'm presenting in English after all, yet I see very little of myself in this long quotation. In other words, I strongly disagree with the our and the we. What about those tens of millions of US citizens and permanent residents whose connections to any alleged West are more distant than mine? And what about those millions of US citizens who were here long before Europeans began arriving roughly 500 years ago? I now speak to you from New York City, the ancestral homelands of the Munsee-speaking Lenni, Lenape, and Karnasi peoples, who were forcibly displaced by Dutch settlers in the 1620s and 30s. These indigenous peoples are still here. They always were, and they should be honored. I strongly doubt that they would see the our and the we in the long quotation on the slide. In hindsight, this quotation could have been set up with a simple clause. As we have been taught by both whiteness and maleness over roughly, but not more than 150 years, the culture of Europe and the Americas, etc. Finally, the 1855 project. One of the most compelling aspects of Nicole Hannah-Jones's 1619 project was to rethink the founding of our country, moving its beginning from 1776 to 1619, highlighting the impact that slavery has had on our history. In the entry for theory in Oxford Music Online, David Carsonberry and Sherman van Salkema placed the beginning of music theory in the United States at 1960. This is when figures like Milton Babbitt and Alan Fort were beginning to make their quote unquote scientific discoveries in the field. But like the 1619 project, I'd like to offer a different starting point for music theory, both in the United States and Europe. 1855, the year the French aristocrat and race pseudoscientist Arthur de Gobineau finished his 4-volume essay on the inequality of human races. This work, which developed the theories of the Aryan master race that were used by the Nazis in the 20th century, also gave musicians working materials with which to build racialized structures. 3 significant musical figures drew inspiration from Gobineau's essay: François-Joseph Fétis, Richard Wagner, and Heinrich Schenker. In his book on Fétis, Thomas Christensen writes that quote, Fétis owned a copy of Gobineau's notorious tract and evidently made much use of it, unquote. Wagner met Gobineau briefly in Rome in 1876, and they became friends until Gobineau died in 1882. Further, Wagner and his wife Cosima carried on a lengthy correspondence with Gobineau in the early 1880s. Schenker praised Gobineau in The Mission of the German Genius, as well as in his diaries 5 times in 1918. Fétis, Wagner, and Schenker were extremely influential in the history of music and music theory in both Europe and the United States. And their beliefs in the racial hierarchies of white supremacy are not in doubt. Specifically, Schenker provides an explicit link between European white supremacy and American music theory. Connecting their beliefs through the countless musicians they influenced to racial injustice in the field is actually not that difficult once one gets going, and one could undoubtedly write a great dissertation or monograph on this topic. But my point here is more modest. I'm suggesting that American music theory did not really begin in the 1960s, but rather with the 19th century intensification of a fallacious race science that sought to prove white superiority and Black inferiority, an intensification that reached an apex of sorts with the 4th and final volume of Gobineau's essay. The 1855 project would unpack the many racialized musical metaphors that stemmed from the racist writings of Fétis, Wagner, and Schenker, and properly reframe music theory in view of the racialized thinking that so strongly undergirds the field to this day. Thank you.
Thanks, Bill, for that fascinating paper. I love this idea of an 1855 project. All right, TEKLA, please continue with your paper.
Right. Hello. I am delighted to be here. Thank you all so much for this incredible conference, and thank you for that really inspiring talk. So what I will be offering today is amputated limbs and breathless lungs, ableist metaphors in A.B. Marx's theories of modality. Introduction. Critiquing ableist frames in music theory. Music theory is filled with metaphors rooted in ableism, sexism, racism, and many other forms of bias and discrimination. Philip Ewell, who we just heard from, has powerfully revealed the racist frame that shaped Heinrich Schenker's theories. Joseph Strauss has critiqued the ideas of normality and deformation that permeate our music theoretical practices. In the spirit of those projects, I will focus on the ableist metaphors employed by the 19th century German theorist A.B. Marx. When I use the term ableism throughout this paper, it refers to discrimination against people with disabilities. As I will propose, Marx uses ableist rhetoric in which he figures the diatonic church modes as a disabled body. Modality has often been associated with otherness in common practice Western art music. My presentation explores an overlooked strand of this discourse by examining how Marx links the church modes with disability. First, though, here's a bit of background information on Marx. He was very influential in his own time. He is perhaps most famous today for having codified sonata form. In fact, the notion of masculine and feminine sonata themes originates largely from Marx, a sexist metaphor that was rightly denounced by Susan McClary. Marx's ideas continue to be influential today. Scott Burnham, for example, has written extensively about Marx and has also translated parts of his treatises. Unremarked, however, is the ableist frame that shapes many of Marx's ideas. I will now examine that frame. Breathless affect, Marx's view of the Lydian mode. Marx's treatise, The School of Musical Composition, 1841, has a long section on the church modes. This section is filled with ableist rhetoric. For instance, he describes the Lydian mode as an ill person gasping for breath, referring to its weak, breathless affect. Marx writes, Beethoven ingeniously reworked the Lydian mode in his quartet, Opus 132. He did so in order to express the prayer of thanksgiving of a deeply weary sick person who longs for the first new pulse of life. The sick person is still surrounded by shivers of death. It is precisely this weak, breathless affect of the Lydian mode that probably led to its disappearance during the Reformation, a time of strong and vigorous faith. In this passage, Marx is referring to the third movement of Beethoven's string quartet in A minor, Opus 132. The movement is titled Holy Song of Thanksgiving from a Convalescent to the Godhead in the Lydian mode. Beethoven composed this movement soon after having recovered from a severe illness. Let's listen to just a little bit of it because it was an important touchstone for Marx's modal metaphors. So that's probably enough. That gives you a little flavor of it. There would be many ways to talk about the modality in this piece, but for Marx, he chose an ableist way of doing it. Marx returned to this piece in his later book, Ludwig van Beethoven, Life and Works, in 1859. Again, Marx describes the Lydian mode as a diseased body. Quote, the title, Holy Song of Thanksgiving from a Convalescent, was not simply an afterthought added later. This is demonstrated not only by the content of the music, but also by the use of the old Lydian mode itself, pathologically weak, krankhaft weiche. Here, Marx likens the Lydian mode to a weak body, almost as though Beethoven's Opus 132 were portraying illness rather than convalescence. One might wonder if Marx's pathological view of the Lydian mode stems from its programmatic use in Beethoven. However, it seems that Marx's view of the modes as disabled is not specific to the Lydian mode, as we will see. Marx's figures of modal throughout the school of musical composition, Marx repeatedly returns to metaphors of disability when theorizing the modes. Thus, Marx views the Phrygian mode as dependent and subordinate. The Phrygian mode is strongly tied to its subdominant. It is also bound to the Dorian through its lack of a dominant harmony. Here, Marx seems to be likening the Phrygian mode to a person with impaired mobility. In addition to analyzing specific modes, such as Phrygian and Lydian, Marx also uses ableist metaphors when making broader generalizations about all of the modes. For instance, Marx argued that the modes forced pretonal composers to avoid certain modulations altogether, while no such restriction exists in the modern system. Here, Marx implies that the modes are restricted, in other words, handicapped, compared to what he perceived as the freer movement of major-minor tonality. Indeed, Marx seems to perceive common practice tonality as a cure for the modal system. He compares tonality to a healthy body. Quote, we modern musicians employ each key as a distinctly defined and totally independent form of expression. In the tonal system, the harmonies on the dominant and subdominant are integral parts, forming two arms of the tonic chord, end quote. The implication here is really fascinating. Marx is implying that non or pretonal systems do not have these arms. What emerges from this metaphor is an ableist conception of the modal system as an amputated body, in contrast to the intact limbs of tonality. For Marx, then, individual modes, as well as the whole system, are weak and disabled. Moving into my concluding thoughts, Marx's images of amputation, paralysis, and breathlessness all serve to pathologize the modes. As I have suggested, Marx uses these ableist metaphors to support his teleological view of tonality as superior to modality. By pathologizing the modes in this way, Marx perpetuates a dichotomy between disability and health, in which he valorizes health as superior to disability. The implications of Marx's ableist metaphors reverberate far beyond musical systems and features as music theory metaphors so often do, as we're really seeing in this conference. Marx's implication, by extension, barrier to healthy people. In conclusion, I would argue that we need to expose, challenge, and counter these ableist metaphors in music theory and in society more generally. Thank you all so much for being here. Looking forward to our discussion afterwards.
Thank you so much, TEKLA. That was a very powerful paper. Steve, would you like to start with our final paper?
Yes, and here we go. I'm sharing right now. So I just want to thank Jade and TEKLA and Phil for this wonderful panel so far, and to Nina and Danny as well for organizing, and everyone who's here. I'm just so excited to be a part of this. So let me just one thing. All right. And so I have these slides here. They're meant mainly for people who want visual cues to follow along with, but you can just listen to the paper and you'll get everything you need just by that. Manouche are a subgroup of Romanese, otherwise known somewhat pejoratively as gypsies, who live primarily in France. They're celebrated as virtuosos in jazz manouche, a genre based on the swing era recordings of legendary manouche guitarist Django Reinhardt. This music is vaunted as part of popular French heritage, but manouche are thought to have a special knack for its performance. This is allegedly due to their heightened sense of aurality and sensoriality, which is supposedly enabled by their immersive and non-literate traditions of music transmission. Professional manouche musicians often valorize their own sensorial approaches in distinction to the music literacy promoted by French schools and conservatories. They draw on sensuous metaphors to link notions of expressivity, naturalness, and ethical behavior to their manouche identity, in contrast to an oppressive and inhumane white French society. They base these metaphors in part on discursive contrasts between Black and white musicalities in the jazz world more broadly, using them to convey their own value, symbolically and materially, as racialized musicians. In this brief presentation, I will argue that advocacy for an aurally centered pedagogical approach is a way for speakers to claim a place in the music industry while critiquing the discrimination they've long faced as racialized subjects. My approach to all of this is informed by a ratio-semiotic framework. Crystal Smalls develops ratio-semiotics to address how, quote, a racialized sign in its co-articulation with other signs simultaneously racializes other signs while reifying or restructuring its own racialized significance, end quote. This approach is necessary in part because of how race works in France. The French government upholds a policy of colorblindness, arguing that to officially recognize the existence of ethnic, racial, or religious minorities constitutes a form of discrimination. This policy amounts to what Eduardo Bonilla Silva calls colorblind racism, and it becomes the primary lens through which to subjugate those who do not culturally fit racially unmarked ideals of white French identity. This universalist ethos provides cover for the widespread acceptance of white supremacy. It is especially in this context of racial denial that attention to all the ways in which race takes shape becomes crucial to understanding its mechanisms. Discourse about musical affect is one way for manouche speakers to articulate their experiences of racialization when doing so in more explicit terms might otherwise be censured. By vaunting their own supposed musical alterity, they recast a seemingly benign mode of racialization and develop a positive sense of manouche personhood within their communities and the music industry. Now let's talk about aurality. In some popular discourse, musicians who rely primarily on their hearing and on kinesic cues, or as some say, those who use their ears, are thought to have a more authentic connection to sound and a heightened capacity for expressivity. In turn, those who depend on music theory or literacy are thought to be capable of handling more complexity at the cost of alienation from the music or the sound itself. Within this frame, the ear becomes a metaphor for the perception of a range of bodily sensations. Aurality can thus include other visual and tactile channels in addition to hearing, in distinction to the supposed intellectualization and abstraction involved in music literacy. And I'll note here that people often assume that formalized Western music theory cannot be comprehended without music literacy, so then theory and literacy are often conflated. These contrasts are then correlated with generalizations about musicians' cultural backgrounds as more or less civilized, intellectual or anti-intellectual, natural or unnatural, and so on. These sets of oppositions constitute a long-standing pattern in discourse about jazz. Kenneth Prudy writes that in contemporary jazz pedagogy, quote, jazz, African-American, intuitive, the community, aural, and Western art music, European, formalized, the academy, written, are established as distinct, even opposed musical systems, end quote. This series of contrasts, which we can summarize and extrapolate as aural literate, primitive civilized, emotional rational, authentic inauthentic, improvised composed, and perhaps even creative uncreative, often takes shape along Black and white racial lines. These contrasts also demonstrate what Susan Gall and Judith Irvine call an axis of differentiation, through which, quote, contrasting qualities in the signs are found or projected onto the contrasting phenomena that the signs are taken to index, end quote. So in the array of signs that are involved in jazz performance and discourse, qualities associated with musical aurality and musical literacy are contrasted with each other and then aligned with others to index the racialized status of individuals and groups. Starting in the 1970s, the development of jazz manouche as a specifically manouche practice was shaped by the widespread idea that racially marked musicians, including both Black and Romani peoples, were more authentically expressive than white musicians. Jazz manouche professionals found traction in the construct of Black aurality in particular, which has long been highly romanticized in France. Over time, these professionals developed a discourse based on the same Black-white axis of differentiation in jazz and all of its attendant contrasts. Contemporary musicians highlight the listening practices, multimodal forms of communication, and cultural immersion that are part of their aural pedagogical approach as both unique to manouche and crucial to the development of competent, sociable, and compassionate humans. For example, in an interview with me, the renowned guitarist and educator Mandino Reinhardt repeatedly contrasted his aural pedagogy to literate pedagogy, saying that musical skill development has to, quote, come naturally. He told me that manouche music pedagogy is characterized by intuition, openness, listening, desire, and visual, but not literate communication, in contrast to an emotionally deficient method centered on fixity, precision, and analysis. Another prominent manouche guitarist, Franco Merstein, told me that manouche reject solfège. He said, quote, our method is really based on visual memory and aural memory. In solfège, for example, you're required to learn writing. You're required to learn all the names of the notes, the names of all the chords, which we do not do at all, end quote. Note here the definitive contrast Franco identifies between literacy and theory on the one hand and aurality on the other. I asked Franco if he thought that learning exclusively by ear was the best way for anyone to learn jazz. He breathed deeply and replied, quote, jazz is an improvisational music, and it's really the heart that speaks. Compared to what is written, you're going to put a lot more emotion into improvisation with the heart, end quote. In France, heart is often invoked simultaneously with the English loanword feeling to convey an irreducible affective intensity and even moral virtue. Among my interlocutors, heart and feeling are frequently contrasted to technical proficiency and attributed to distinctively manouche musicalities. Improvisation is already considered a litmus test for both technical skill and emotional honesty in jazz. And Franco makes it clear that good improvisation must come as naturally as speaking, which requires the non-literate cultivation of a heartful approach. The set of contrasts I've briefly laid out at the level of sound and musical skill operate together as cross-scalar indexes of musicians' personal and interpersonal characteristics and of the ethno-racial categories to which they ascribe themselves. They're also taken as indicators of Manouche moral and ethical superiority. In describing their aurality-centered practices, Mondino, Franco, and other speakers develop metaphorical constellations based on racialized ideas about musical expressivity. Doing so reproduces hegemonic racial logics while attempting to reconfigure the value of such logics. In closing, I'd like to explain why I titled this paper Better Sense. First, we can take better sense in idiomatic terms as good judgment, what Manouche players believe they are exercising through their aural approaches. Sense can also be considered in terms of sensoriality, and clearly these musicians feel that they are superior in this regard. Finally, we can understand better sense in the imperative. That is, you better sense the music as opposed to learning it using overly abstract methods. Together, these senses of better sense capture a few of the dimensions of discursive racialization I've been getting at. I've shown that the valorization of Manouche aurality both reflects and amplifies a series of ideological contrasts along a racialized axis of differentiation. I've also tried to underscore how Manouche discursive strategies to unsettle the terms of their racialization are necessarily framed in relation to white supremacist logics. Instead of explicitly dismantling racial stereotypes, some Manouche musicians play on, with, and through them. Their embrace of aurality is as much an endorsement of ethno-racial difference as it is a critique of the white supremacy that undergirds social and economic life well beyond French borders. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Steve, for that really broadly conceived and thought-provoking paper. So we have 10 minutes now for some Q&A. We're posting an ethics of engagement statement in the chat, but in short, we ask that you approach this discussion with kindness, curiosity, and respect for the different positions we're all bringing to the table. I'd like to invite everyone to post questions in the chat or raise your Zoom hand, whichever you're more comfortable with. I can actually start us off. I have a question for TEKLA. I love how you had us listen to a little bit of the Beethoven, and it made me kind of reflect on some of the ableist dichotomies that are kind of listening expectations that were taught to, especially with Beethoven. So I was thinking of like the heroic versus the kind of pathetic, the pathétique kind of dichotomy. So I wanted to ask you how much you see Marx's ableist metaphor as kind of partaking in this a larger culture of reception of Beethoven at his time, and also how you would suggest that we can reframe some of our listening expectations.
Yeah, thank you for that really fabulous question about Beethoven reception. I think Marx did help to shape a lot of those ideas about Beethoven's music as a process of overcoming battle and heroism, which then means Beethoven that enact a different narrative. I think Opus 132 could maybe be heard as celebrating disability. It has the convalescence section alternating with the section feeling new strength and then convalescence again. I think it's showing that life is a cycle through different stages of health and illness, and it's okay for life to be that. And thanks again for the question.
That's such a fantastic interpretation. Thank you. If there are still no questions yet, I certainly have more. So I have a question for you, Phil. I wanted to ask about, so I loved your paper. I see that you're trying to kind of change the start date of American music theory from 1960 back to 1855. However, I have read a little bit of Kwame Anthony Apia's writing on the West, and I know that he says that there's this kind of revivifying of this idea of the West around the Cold War. And so I wanted to ask you, like, we don't often think of America's like 20th century geopolitics as being part of the history of music theory, but I wanted to ask you how much you think these kind of more recent uses of the West have influenced this history.
Thanks, Jade. Great question. And thanks, Steve and TEKLA for those papers too. That was really great. Yeah, obviously what's happened recently, well, let's just start with what's happening in Ukraine. And there's a war with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, right? And with that action, among all of the horrors and the tragedies, what Vladimir Putin has done is he's really breathed a lot of new life in the entire concept of the West, right? Whereas the West was fragmenting and kind of like on something of a downward spiral in some significant ways. He's really unified it, really brought it back to the forefront so that we can think of now the West as something that's very definable and something that's just very real, right? And without question, you mentioned the Cold War and 20th century and Soviet Union. Yeah, to a large extent, the West, and especially mid-century music, the Music Academy in 1960 as a start date for American music theory, that very much was in a line with the Cold War thinking as the West as opposed to everything that the Soviet Union represented. So there are a lot of geopolitical concerns, to use that word that you used. And I personally am not so naive to think that the concept of the West is going to go anywhere anytime soon. It's going to take decades and decades. But still undergirding it all is this very real notion that it is completely metaphorical, completely mythological, as Rebecca Fudo Kennedy, I think, writes about best of all, in that this is just a 19th century way to tie together. Kwame Anthony Appiah also says, what was Christendom became Europe, which became the West in the late 19th century, only to tie together whiteness. I mean, that is by far and away the best and most accurate metaphor and euphemism for the West, which is just white, which is why we consider Australia to be the West, despite the fact that longitudinally it actually lies east of China, and why we consider, for instance, a country like Nicaragua maybe not to be the West, even though it's completely in the Western hemisphere, because it's not majority white, right? So I think that there are a lot of moving parts to this notion. I was thinking about it when Steve was giving her paper, also mentioned France as this officially colorblind society, which I've always said is even worse than what we have in the United States. And we have lots of problems with respect to race, right? We have something of a racial dystopia, in my opinion, going on. Did I answer your question, Jade? I think I did.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah, and I always think about how like Western classical music is probably listened to more in China than like in the West anymore. Okay, we have a question in the chat for TEKLA from Charles Epley. I'll read it out. Charles says, I really appreciate the deep dive into musicological rhetoric and ableist metaphor. I wonder if you can talk about how this historical foundation impacts musical culture and scholarship education, and what some strategies are for moving forward. In other words, what's at stake?
I love that question because I definitely want to move beyond critique into some generative solutions. I do think the modes are still often taught today as being inferior versions of tonality. This idea of the Mixolydian mode lacks a leading tone. The Phrygian mode has a diminished and therefore non-functional dominant. And I think it would be great to try to reframe our pedagogy and writings around the modes to celebrate what they do have. The Phrygian has this amazing upper leading tone. The Lydian has this great leading tone to the dominant pitch. Let's try to reframe it as the things the modes can give us that would supplement the things tonality gives us, instead of setting it up as a kind of binary opposition.
That's a great, extremely music theoretical answer, TEKLA. Thank you. There's a question in the chat from Noah Kars for Professor Ewell. Noah says, in moving back the start date, I'm wondering how you account for music theory at US music schools in the first half of the 20th century. Were the same racial theories drawn on as explicitly by those in the era of Walter Piston, Horatio Parker, etc.?
Great question, Noah. Hi, Noah. And I immediately look to Ben's citation right underneath to Carl Seashore. Hi, Ben. The short answer is yes, explicitly yes. So I don't know too much about Walter Piston and Horatio Parker in terms of their racial beliefs. I would be stunned if they were anything close to anti-racist, right? To use Ibram Kendi's tripartite, segregationism, assimilationism, anti-racism, the vast majority of white people in the 19th and for sure early 20th century, and sadly even today, are very still assimilationist in their beliefs, that there is somehow a mythically higher white level of humanity and that we should all be striving to that. Sive essentially made that point tangentially about Roma musicians in France. And without question, I mean, Carl Seashore was a eugenicist. George Eastman was a eugenicist who turned to Howard Hanson in 1924 to lead NOAA, your own PhD institution, the Eastman School of Music, for 40 years. Howard Hanson was pretty reliably bigoted, especially in an anti-Jewish and anti-gay way. And he was extremely influential in the National Association for Schools of Music, NASM. So those structures, I think the best citation I can actually give is not about music. I would cite Linda Gordon, NYU history professor, and her The Second Coming of the KKK. It's a monograph that came out probably 8-10 years ago. In that book, you read about the second coming of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s, and where she says something like, it's probably even a majority of Americans who view the KKK positively, not members, not card-carrying members, but Harry Truman was a member briefly in the 1920s of the KKK. Fred Trump, Donald Trump's father, was I could walk to Queens where he was arrested in 1927 in full KKK regalia. Fred Trump. And so to actually have people who were creating musical structures in the 1920s that were not like Carl Seashore and George Eastman and Howard Hanson, that would be a stunning thing, because that's just not the way that the musical structures were being created in the early 20th century. There was nothing about it that they were created by white people, and they were, of course, putting forth European music, which was in their mind created by white people, despite the fact that Roma have been in Europe for many, many centuries. I always make the point that there have always been people of color in Europe. There have never not been people of color in Europe, full stop. That's just a fact. And that is something that, this mythical belief that white people come from Europe it's kind of a uniquely American thing in many ways, in that we have kind of perfected the European invention of white supremacy in a very, unfortunate way. I don't want to end on such an unfortunate note. We have a search going on, and I'm chairing the search, so I do have to leave now. Is there anything that I could say that might be a little more uplifting as I part ways with this great panel?
Actually, Phil, I'm going to throw in a question for Sive, so we don't have to end on the...
Well, my 10-second silver lining is I really do believe now in the 21st century that there are people like out at UCLA and Danny and Nina doing great work that will allow us to actually turn away from some of those old racialized and gendered ways of thinking that are still so deeply ingrained. We're actually really moving quite fast now. So there's my happy ending for everybody. And I do have to go, but thank you all so much, and do carry on. Cheers.
Thanks, Phil.
Bye.
Sive, I have a quick question for you, which actually kind of relates to the theme of this whole conference. So your paper was so richly theorized and just so thought-provoking. But I thought it was such a brilliant move to kind of recognize that these statements of playing from the heart are themselves, they're metaphors, that playing from the heart is still a metaphor. But I was kind of wondering if if the Manouche musicians that you're speaking with, if they would agree with that. Like, I'm wondering what you think they would think of this whole idea of metaphor, and if it might point to kind of some of the limits of this metaphor discourse.
Thank you, Jade. That's a great question, and I certainly don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, so I can't speak definitively on their behalf. I think to some extent they would not see a problem, or even like really, full, like they wouldn't be theorizing metaphor in the same way we're doing at this conference right now. What I think they would actually say is that any musical experience is purely ineffable, and the better it is, the more ineffable it must be by definition, because it's something that exceeds words. So I think the very thought of being able to capture what it is they're doing and the full affective intensity of that is just, it's not comprehensible in language. So that's kind of, I think they might even bristle a little at it. I'm not quite sure, but they use metaphors themselves all the time. So yeah, I think that's a problem that is common to musicians regardless of ethno-racial background, for sure.
All right, thank you so much, Steve. Thank you, TEKLA, and thank you to Phil in absentia, and thank you so much to our conference organizers, Nina and Danny. And now we'll take a short break and move on to our next panel. Thanks.